Let's take a look at the RTX 3060 up against the RX 6600 XT from AMD, because this is really interesting. A lot of people think about that 60 class as where they'd like to jump in, but unfortunately for Nvidia, their price, or maybe fortunately for Nvidia, the prices on the 3060s have kind of stagnated, while the AMD competitor 6600 XT has continued to fall. Let's go ahead and look at what the current pricing is like before we get into some side-by-side comparisons. So the RTX 3060, the cheapest possible models are around $380. So they're still well above their $330 MSRP despite being so old at this point. Now, even these cheapest models, you have to keep in mind, are generally going to be these little single fan coolers, like these, although sometimes you can get a 2-fan cooler at this lower price point, so another thing to consider. Now, the RX 6600 XT, until recently had been close in price to the 3060, but as of a few weeks ago, we started to be able to get models for around $300, and multiple models have been available at that price. Currently, the Power Color Fighter with a little 2-fan cooler is available at that price with no mail-in rebates or anything like that required, direct from Amazon, shipped and sold by Amazon with Prime shipping available. And the MSI Mech is also currently available at that price, although this one does require relying on a $20 mail-in rebate. The particular model we'll be testing in this video is actually the ASRock Challenger DOC, which currently costs $330, and I was able to use a mail-in rebate to get it down to $300 when I purchased it, but that rebate is no longer available, but we still definitely have $300 models available. The RTX 3060 that I'm testing in this video is actually probably the most overkill cooler you could get, which is the ROG Strix OC-V2. And no, please do not spend this much money on that. Buy a much better GPU for that price. I purchased my 3060 for testing on the channel when all GPU prices were a lot higher, and believe it or not, this model came in stock lower price than a lot of other ones at the time I was purchasing, and that's why I went ahead and got it. The rest of the system is an R9 5950X CPU with PBO enabled, and then we have 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL16 memory. Let's do some side-by-sides and I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. All right, we'll start the comparison looking at Cyberpunk 2077 at the 1080p Ultra settings, because a lot of you will be considering these GPUs for 1080p. I think that's where they're best used. And while these games will absolutely crush so many games at maxed out 1080p, a lot of GPUs struggle with games as demanding as Cyberpunk. And if you're buying a GPU, you should be thinking about the next few years of use. So using a game that is more demanding than typical, like Cyberpunk, I believe is a good idea to get an idea of what your performance might be like for the next couple of years in bigger AAA titles. Although, of course, predicting the future is always, a bit of a hit or miss proposition. Now, we're seeing that both GPUs here were easily able to average above 60 FPS. The 6600 XT does seem to be reporting lower power draw. The temperatures seem fine on both. And remember, the RTX 3060 has the ROG Strix cooler, which is a bit of a beast here. So let's go ahead and get the averages, but I think we'll confirm that both GPUs can certainly average above 60 FPS, even in a demanding title like this one. Now, by turning down the settings to high, in a lot of games, the ultra settings don't look that much better, but you can turn down to high and then get significantly improved performance. So in many situations, gaming at high, especially if your monitor is capable of going above 60 FPS, would certainly be advised. Now, once again, we are seeing a very good performance from both GPUs, although like we saw at the Ultra settings, the 6600 XT does have a very small lead. Although I think if you weren't running the frame rate counter and staring at it, I think you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between which GPU you are actually using here. So I think this pretty much confirms that if you're buying either of these GPUs for 1080p, you'll be able to be happy in pretty much any game coming out in the near future. Although ray tracing could be a little bit of a different story, but we'll visit that, that section of the video in a little bit. Again, both GPUs reporting minimums above 60 FPS at the high settings. Now, these GPUs could both be considered for 1440p, but I think it's important to show here that in the most demanding AAA titles, you are certainly not going to be maxing the game out at 1440p on either of them. And so, the other important thing, like I mentioned before with the 1080p results, though, is that, the ultra settings don't have to be used. So we will certainly compare some other options here in just a second, but I did want to show that while both of these are reasonable choices for 1440p, the performance that you're getting here, some people, how should I put this, really feel bad when they have to turn some settings down, regardless of the what the image actually looks like on the screen, or your enjoyment of actually playing the game. So I don't need to dwell on this in this video, but for those of you who are like, I must have all the settings maxed out, these are definitely not going to do that for you at 1440p in the most demanding games. And we see the 3060 with a slight lead there, although it's pretty much a tie. Now, realistically, like I said, both of these GPUs can handle 1440p just fine. With native resolution, going down to the medium settings in a game like Cyberpunk is easily delivering a 60 FPS average or above, whereas the other option is to use some upscaling. Now, in Cyberpunk, it has DLSS and it has FSR, but it only has the FSR 1.0 implementation. Yes, I'm aware that there is a mod that can mod DLSS to function as FSR 2.0 in this game and enable it on AMD GPUs, but that's a mod. It's not officially supported by the game, so I don't think that's fair to include in a benchmark review other than mentioning that that is available and could be the topic for a separate video. Now, here we're once again seeing very, very similar performance between the two GPUs, but as is generally the case, the NVIDIA architecture pulls a little bit ahead at the higher resolutions, but both GPUs are delivering very good performance, and it's really, for the most part, a tie. Now, I don't think that 4K is a particularly useful test for these GPUs. So for the rest of the video, I think I'll leave out the 4K results and focus on 1080p and 1440p. But I did want to give a bit of a 4K stress test just to show that, if you're going to be using this from time to time, maybe on your 4K TV, when you usually play on a 1080p or 1440p monitor, something like that, these GPUs certainly can deliver a reasonable 4K experience, but just expect to be relying on upscaling in games as demanding as Cyberpunk. And again, Cyberpunk will not be the only game that we test in this video, and we will certainly show that these GPUs are even more capable when we're not using such a demanding game. But going down to the medium settings and upscaling here, both GPUs are pretty playable experiences. It's also interesting seeing the FSR 1.0 quality versus DLSS balanced. I think DLSS balanced does look a bit better despite being at a lower internal rendering resolution. So let's go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room, which is ray tracing. Now, I've noticed in my testing that these particular ray tracing effects that you use have a big impact on the difference in performance between the two GPUs. You can see here that at the RT low settings, the 3060 absolutely has an advantage, but it's not a mind-blowingly large advantage. But the RT low settings are just local shadows. Other ray tracing effects will show a wider performance delta between the two GPUs. I'm also showing using upscaling here, although I've got to say that at 1080p, I don't like using upscaling on either GPU personally. I think at this low of a resolution, the upscale doesn't look great, and it would be better to use it in a pinch on really low-end hardware. That being said, the DLSS quality upscale does look noticeably better than the FSR 1.0 spatial upscale. at this resolution. Although, like I said, personal preferences here would be to try to use the native resolution at 1080p on both of them. We see about a 10% ray tracing lead there from the 3060 when we had the local shadows at the native resolution. But when we move up to the ray traced medium preset, things get to be a significantly larger lead for the RTX 3060. The RT medium preset in this game includes sun shadows as well as local shadows, and it sets the ray traced lighting to the medium setting. And you can see that both GPUs pretty much lose at the native resolution. So really, these ray tracing effects are too much for either of them. And so that might make you think, well, then really, how much should we care about the ray tracing performance if the only ray tracing that they can actually run is the local shadows? Well, other games aren't as demanding as Cyberpunk. And like I said, upscaling is available. I don't like to do it at 1080p. To me, you're losing more image quality than you're gaining from the ray tracing. But again, the DLSS quality does significantly improve performance, and the upscale result looks a bit better than the FSR result, although, like I said, I don't like any of those results. Now, another thing to look at is ray traced reflections. And here's another one where we see a large performance gap between the AMD and the Nvidia GPU, much, much larger than the 10% or so performance gain we saw with just the local shadows. Reflections are a much larger, performance delta, and I would argue are significantly more impactful to the actual image in the game, to the point where some people might consider using the RT reflections with DLSS quality on the RTX 3060 because the performance is actually quite good at those settings. Although, like I said, personally, I notice all of the extra aliasing in the lines in the pavement and things like that from the DLSS upscale at 1080p, whereas some people won't. So, and you do get the noticeably better reflections as part of the deal. And we can see here that that far right setting actually did deliver a good average performance in this game and could possibly be usable. But now let's look at a game that's just easier to run overall, including with ray tracing, and that is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Also mention that my 1080p footage on my 6600 XT and all of my AMD GPUs in this game record kind of choppy, and I don't know why. The actual image on the screen looked significantly smoother. So anyway, look at the frame time graph. Now I will say the AMD frame time graph here is also more bouncing around a bit more than on the 3060. So again, we're seeing that RT reflections are a significant advantage for the RTX 3060, and that the AMD GPU could turn on some ray tracing here, but you would be dipping below 60 FPS. Now, if you just turn off ray tracing, both GPUs are delivering excellent 1080p performance and still above 60 FPS at 1440p Ultra. So this is a game where I was saying that in many games, both of these GPUs actually can max out 1440p performance. It just needs to be a less demanding title than Cyberpunk. So these are certainly worth considering for 1440p if that's where your budget range is at. Also notice that this game has an NVIDIA advantage, whereas we saw the 6600 XT with a small lead but basically a tie in Cyberpunk. We're seeing a larger performance lead here for the RTX 3060. Now, both GPUs are delivering a good performance, but some games just have an advantage one way or the other. Now, let's look at God of War. This is interesting because it's a DX11 title where NVIDIA used to have a larger performance advantage, but some recent driver updates from AMD improved their DX11 performance. And you can see here that it is basically a tie, with maybe a tiny lead at 1080p for the 6600 XT and a tiny lead with the shadows when we, it's basically a tie, guys. But I'm also showing the ultra settings versus turning the shadows down to high, because in a more demanding scene like this one, at the native ultra setting, both GPUs did dip below 60 FPS. So small win for the 6600 XT. Turn the shadows down a bit if you want to have much more high frame rate experience. Now at 1440p, both GPUs struggle at the ultra settings, but turning them down to the original settings, which would match what the PlayStation 4 delivered in terms of visual quality, although, you know, the original PlayStation 4 was not delivering this kind of performance at 1440p, so you're certainly still getting a better image, you know, overall and experience than the PS4 delivered with both of these GPUs. And as we turn the corner here, we'll once again see the performance dip a bit on all of them, but at the original settings, both GPUs are once again delivering solid 1440p performance, and I'm still seeing a slight lead for the 6600 XT in this title, whereas a lot of people feel like the 3060 pulls ahead at 1440p. We're not seeing that in this title. Now, the main thing I wanted to look at here was FSR 2.0 versus DLSS quality, since Cyberpunk only allowed us to look at the 1.0 spatial upscale. FSR 2.0 is a much better competitor visual quality-wise to DLSS than the 1.0 version was, although while this is by no means a full review of the comparison, looking at Kratos' beard as he breathes out is one of the more noticeable things in this scene, but also as objects are disoccluded or in a lot of motion. DLSS certainly looks sharper. For a more extensive review of DLSS versus FSR 2.0, I'd point you towards some of the Digital Foundry YouTube channel's coverage, especially in this game. They did a really great job highlighting where FSR 2.0 could still have some room for improvement. Let's look at another game. So this is Horizon Zero Dawn, another game that originated on the PlayStation 4, and another game that both GPUs are able to max out not only at 1080p, but also at 1440p. And once again, we're seeing a small but present performance lead at both resolutions, a larger lead at 1080p and a smaller lead at 1440p. And yeah, so again, we're seeing that these GPUs, I think some people say that they're too weak for 1440p, and I really think that just depends on your standards. Easier or older games, you can definitely max them out. You know, not every game, though. Now, let's look at Red Dead Redemption 2. We're looking at the 1080p Ultra settings versus the hardware unboxed optimized settings. I chose this night scene because it's easier to see some of the differences between that you turn down in the optimized settings than it is in some of the other scenes that I've used. Now at 1440p, we see both GPUs dipping below 60 FPS at the maximum settings, but if you're willing to live with those optimized settings, which still look quite good, they're delivering very, very good experiences with the 6600 XT, giving us a small performance lead. But once again, it's so close, it's basically a tie. So which one, if any, should you buy? Well, at 1080p, both of these GPUs are absolutely crushing it. And so I really think that either one you would be happy with. The question is, should you spend more money on the Nvidia GPU? Well, what do you get for the money? I mean, it does have an extra 50% VRAM, 4 more gigabytes, but I don't think we saw in our testing the VRAM capacity causing anything crazy happening, unless maybe that was factored into the ray tracing performance. But I think that's more limited by the ray tracing hardware rather than really the VRAM capacity being an issue. Now, I really think that 8 gigabytes of VRAM at 1080p is going to be absolutely fine at any settings in games that these GPUs will be handling anyway, unless you're getting into any kind of really niche or weird situations. I think by the time games are going to need more than 8 gigabytes of RAM at 1080p, you'd be more than likely turning down settings by that point anyway, which will reduce the VRAM capacity. So I don't think the VRAM here for most people in a gaming workload would really matter. Now, if we switch over to a productivity standpoint, which wasn't really the main point of this video, but I should bring it up, there are situations where having a larger VRAM buffer could be useful in productivity, and in a lot of productivity applications, NVIDIA hardware is better supported. Now, different programs will have different levels of AMD versus NVIDIA optimization, and I'm not an expert on all of that. I would just encourage you to, if there's particular programs that you rely on for your productivity workload, you should try to research how well those support AMD if you're considering the AMD option, because many productivity apps are programmed for the market share leader, which is Nvidia, and AMD support does lag behind. Now, when it comes to gaming situations again, I think that the obvious standout feature there is ray tracing. However, I think what we saw here is that the RTX 3060 can use some limited ray tracing in certain titles, but it's not going to be able to enable the kind of like completely ray traced, like RT Ultra kinds of stuff that really gives you a mind-blowing difference from just the rasterized image quality. So whether that's worth a $80 price increase to you is, up to you. I tried to show many, a wide variety of ray trace settings. AMD was able to keep up, fell about 10% behind in local shadows in Cyberpunk, but other than that, fell significantly behind. And to be honest, I don't think that the shadow settings are impactful enough to really be worth the performance hit on either GPU, to be honest. So my personal thoughts is at this performance tier, my usual ray tracing setting would be off, although it does look like the 3060 can sometimes get away with a little bit of it. So that is definitely an added benefit. Now, another major difference between the two brands was the upscaling, where you run the game at a lower render resolution to increase performance, and it tries to make it look like the native resolution with FSR and DLSS. And while DLSS has a massive image quality advantage over FSR 1.0, the 2.0 version of FSR does look pretty good, although I still give the edge to DLSS. And FSR 2.0 has a long way to go when it comes to implementation in games, since it was only released fairly recently. We are seeing new games, like as of the time of filming, we did see the Spider-Man remastered PC version come out with both DLSS and FSR 2.0 from day one, and that was excellent to see. And I'm sure to see more of that in the future, although currently there are more titles with DLSS 2.0 support. But there are a lot of user-made mods where pretty much any game, to my knowledge, or at least many games, with DLSS 2.x of some version, can be modded to use the FSR 2.0 assets and then run a unoptimized, not by the developers version of FSR 2.0 on the games, and that could have been done in Cyberpunk and things like that. So, again, if you're playing at 1080p, though, my personal preference would not upscale at all. So I wouldn't actually weigh that too heavily for the 1080p results. So at 1080p, I've got to say, I really think if you're budget conscious here, saving the extra money and going the AMD route makes a lot of sense. Just given that the performance overall is usually basically a tie, although slightly better on the AMD GPU when we're not ray tracing. And like I said, I'd usually leave ray tracing and upscaling turned off on the GPUs at this level and at 1080p. So that's my personal preference. Now, I should bring up drivers. So a lot of people find the NVIDIA drivers to have a better reputation for stability. That would be like fewer game crashes, things like that. I have experienced fewer game crashes on my NVIDIA GPUs, although I never had a nightmare experience on my AMD GPUs either, and I've explored this topic much further in other videos. Maybe I'll remember to put a link to that up above. So basically, you are, I think, getting a better GPU from the RTX 3060. But, if you can afford $300 and $380 to $400 is a pretty big stretch for what are you really getting. I think going the AMD route makes a lot of sense, although I could also bring up live streaming. The NVIDIA encoder at low bit rates when you're live streaming will give you a better looking live stream just due to it being a better encoder for low bit rates. Whereas if you're recording videos for YouTube like I am, you can just use a higher bitrate recording and both GPUs look good. In my footage, I oftentimes see a slight color difference between the two GPUs, which I'm going to chalk up to their encoder and as just like an encoding difference. But overall, I think both of them work really well. And for live streaming, the NVIDIA GPU would have a bit of an edge. But I think most people buying this level of GPU aren't really a professional live streamer. It's probably more of a little hobby. So does it matter that much if there's a bit more image quality on the live stream? Is it worth the extra $80 for you? I think for some people who are concerned about all of those aspects where NVIDIA does have a little edge, I think for some people that does add up to being worth the extra money and going for it. Although I will say, if you're going to be considering the RTX 3060 from NVIDIA, you might actually look into seeing if you could snag a Founders Edition 3060 Ti for $400 from Best Buy when stock drops on those. It has been getting a lot easier lately. And the 3060 Ti is just hands down crushing the 3060 in everything other than VRAM capacity, which doesn't usually come into play that much either way. Now, at 1440p, you might, I don't know, the 3060 gains a few percentage points of performance relative to the 6600 XT at 1440p versus our 1080p results. Although, really, once again, their rasterized performance is so close that I would really consider it for the most part a tie, other than in particular games where one GPU is heavily favored. Now, at 1440p, neither of these GPUs are going to be handling ray tracing, so I just don't think ray tracing should factor into your decision at 1440p. However, because DLSS 2.x has both wider support as well as slightly better image quality than FSR 2.0, I think that the upscaling becomes a lot more important at this resolution, because at 1440p, you're more likely to want to upscale. And the upscaling with like DLSS or FSR 2.0 at the quality setting can look very good to the point where a lot of people would want to use that. That upscaling advantage for NVIDIA, I think, does become a bit more noteworthy. However, if you're the kind of person who wouldn't mind, at least for now, while FSR 2.0 is pretty new, doing some mods to games if you have to mod FSR 2.0 support into a game that has DLSS support, then I think this becomes a bit of a non-issue, and it's really whether that slight edge on image quality to the upscale, as well as not having to go through the modding hassle for now and things like that, is worth the $80 price jump between the two GPUs, because honestly, guys, that is a massive price jump. My overall conclusion is I really think at 1440p, I'd try to push you towards 3060 Ti or 6700 XT levels of performance rather than either of these GPUs. Although, as we saw in our testing, if you're willing to turn down settings in the more demanding games, both of these do great at 1440p. So if you're budget strapped and $300 is the budget, well, I mean, I guess you're grabbing that 6600 XT anyway, right? Overall, this is a really interesting comparison, in my opinion. And I think both of these are good GPUs, although AMD is certainly offering better value, and I think I would choose that AMD GPU over the 3060. And it becomes a little bit more interesting if we move up to the 3060 Ti versus 6700 XT. I think that's a bit more competitive. I think AMD gets the win here unless you need some of those, like I said, special situations where NVIDIA has some advantages. I hope all of you have an excellent day.